I'm Kavita Puri. I'm the author of the book Partition Voices, Untold Stories, which is being adapted by Tara Theatre into the play Silence.
Hi, my name's Iqbal Khan and I'm directing Silence for Tara Theatre, adapted from Kavita Puri's book Untold Stories.
How are rehearsals?
Okay, so we're at the beginning of our third week. And we're in a very exciting place. So we've got, obviously this is a company that's almost totally new to the piece. So it takes a while to kind of just take on board the scale of this piece, the history, the kind of getting a sense of what their personal connection is to the material, and then getting our heads around a new staging for it. So no, we've made quite a lot of progress actually. Staging-wise, we've got a sense of the shape of most of it, and it's wonderful to sort of see them beginning to kind of own it. And it is a tremendous company of actors. So very exciting, very emotional.
It is emotional, isn't it?
But very exciting.
Can I ask you, when you read the book, what did you think?
Almost every story was a revelation. Because it's one thing to read histories and to sort of kind of get a sense of what the sort of macro politics are, and they're contended and it keeps changing. But to get that kind of the oral testimony of people who lived through it and how contradictory those experiences are, how complex they are, you're sort of in history in a way that you aren't when you encountered different kinds of histories of the event. So it was, and so much of it had resonances for me to do with my parents' generation and the sort of prejudices and complacent assumptions you have, even being sort of, you know, descended from people who went through it. It's shocking, moving, surprising, and surprisingly life-affirming, actually. It wasn't just a book of a catalogue of trauma.
No, it's not.
It's a catalogue of survivors, you know. I both read the book and then interspersed it with listening to the series on BBC iPlayer, BBC Sounds, of the conversations and
so you could hear them.
And the testimonies, and that begins to move us towards this play where you start to hear their voices. And it's one thing to kind of engage with the words and the experiences on the page, but when you hear them, particularly if you're second generation like me, and I have those voices in my ear, and then that kind of, it sort of shortcuts the brain, really. It goes straight to the heart.
And is it your family history as well?
Yes, I mean, one removed. Most of my family were on the Pakistan side of things, but a lot of my extended family moved, and so I've had stories around this all my life, and but you know, nothing was balanced. You had sort of shards of things, and actually engaging with the testimonies across the board in the book just gives you such a sense of the chaos of the times, the provisionality of it. Heartbreaking. I mean, really heartbreaking on all sides.
I feel a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
Because some of these people are still alive. This is their lives. Do you feel that responsibility too? Massively.
I mean, I feel it in a double sense. I feel the responsibility to you, and the testimonies that you presented, and to ensure that when we theatricalize them, that we're not aestheticizing them. You know, that the truth of their testimony is communicated as powerfully as possible, and also the way you present them, you present the range of things, and in the way that Abdul Shaikh, the artistic director whose idea this was, and it's a approach you to adapt it for the theatre. You know, which of the stories do you choose to represent those range of experiences? I mean, I'm sure that was a very big conversation with you about. Yeah,
because we had to make sure that very complex tapestry of experience, whether it's religions, or gender, because the female experience was a very particular experience, but geography as well. We have British colonial voices as well, because we're in Britain, this is our shared history. so we had to choose really carefully because we couldn't have all the stories.
No.
We had to have some of the stories. And then the writers then took those stories and interpreted them to a degree. I mean, it's still very much the interviewees, you know, in their voices. And it was lovely. They came last time to see it and they were really pleased with it. But it's, you know, it's hard for me because I have to give away some of this. Yeah. But I feel that there's a responsibility to those interviewees, but also to tell this complicated history, this difficult history that we're only so late on, 70 years, 75 years now, grappling with, to tell that story carefully.
Yeah, yeah.
But also remember this is a drama and that people come to kind of not enjoy, but, you know, have an experience.
Well, I think that's right. It's interesting how the minute you said carefully, there is a sense of like, yes, we need to honor these voices, but when you present the drama, you because you're doing it in such a constrained way, an hour and a half of potentially exhausting, overwhelming testimony, that there's the opportunity to kind of present a range of voices, surprising voices. There's humor in there, and actually the ability to just attend to the rhythm of the experience, so that the audience are constantly being surprised, refreshed, so that the ears can tune into tragedy, as it were, and we can constantly not only kind of potentially pummel them with pain, but actually surprise them with joy and heroism.
Joy and heroism and naughtiness, but it's love.
That's right.
And that's the thing that surprised me when I did the interviews. I knew, I braced myself for horror stories because that's what we heard, right? But what I didn't expect was stories of love of your land, love of the people that you had to leave behind, and how that love sustained for decades and decades, even if people didn't go back. And so you have really painful stories, but you have strangely uplifting uplifting stories as well. And it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And it's the resilience of these people is extraordinary, because this isn't, it's not, in every case, it's not a silence that's born out of like a disabling, crushing trauma. It's often silence that's to do with what allows them to keep moving forwards, and what's the legacy to their children that helps them move forward, and what's not useful to talk about.
But it's resilience to have survived that particular historical moment.
Yes.
But then a resilience to have come to this country in those early post-war years, and to have survived. And, you know, the play is called Silence. They had to just keep looking forward, and they had to keep kind of looking at the future. And you can see why they wanted to shield their children, because why would you want to remind them of those horrors? You're in a new country now. And so it's a resilience that first generation had on so many levels that I honestly think that we are still just kind of understanding now. And that, you know, that generation isn't going to be with us for that much longer now, when you know, that generation who survived the partition and then came to Britain.
And actually even the colonial voices, as it were, the white voices in it, the voices that you've chosen, and certainly the voice that we've chosen in the adaptation, in the theatrical adaptation, is a surprising voice, because again it's a voice that, yes, is informed by privilege, but is also profoundly informed by love of India.
Totally, and still feels that love, and feels a part of him is still in India. I think he said when I interviewed him, he said he still dreamed in Hindi. His first language was Hindi, because that was the language of his ayah. He was a boy at the time of partition. And I think that's why it's interesting doing these interviews and doing the play in Britain. Because, you know, these people who lived through partition were subjects of the Raj. They remember empire, and then they came to Britain, and they're British citizens. They became British citizens. And it is a history. It's a complicated history over hundreds of years.
Yes.
But I think for me it was really important to tell that colonial British story, because that's not just one story.
No.
It is just as nuanced, and of course their experience of partition was totally different, and it's really important to say that. They did not suffer in the same way as South Asians did. But you know, there are people living in our country today who were born in India, who grew up in India, who still speak Hindi or Urdu, and they feel something.
Oh yeah, and the other thing that's wonderful in the is to have the different generational voices. So you do have a young couple that in this new version of the piece begin the piece, and they begin, you know, they're a mixed heritage couple. One of them has a Hindu line with English, I think. No, Hindu and English and French and Muslim, who are sort of on the eve of their marriage, and they're talking about the hunger that this experience you're interviewing has released in them to learn more about this trajectory, this history that they were so unaware of, and how to place themselves in it.
But also they found out that their grandparents had lived really close.
Yeah, an hour away from each other.
The only thing that divided them was religion, because they speak Punjabi, they love Punjabi food.
Well, I mean,
the music's the same, the tradition's the same.
Exactly.
You know.
And actually, I mean, that's what also makes this feel like such an important and urgent piece for now, because the minute you identified or are identified by those in power as being a certain thing, and that the resources available to you are going to be based on how we've identified you. You create these tribes and these separations and this, you know, and it feels like we're very much sort of living through this kind of division.
But I would say, and that couple that you talk about, are totally counter to that.
Yeah.
That especially a younger generation are really happy with saying, you know, my family were from this place and then they moved to this place. And, you know, I'm British, but I'm, you know, from Birmingham. Like, you can absorb lots and lots of different identities.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good thing.
Oh, I think that's an amazing thing. I think that's the thing that I think that we need to be reminded of. That is quintessentially what this multicultural society does best, and the thing that we should be celebrating. And I know there are lots of counter pressures at the moment to kind of move in other directions that are located in separation, but actually they are the perfect example of what is best about Britain, really, modern Britain.
What's been the hardest thing putting the play on, do you think?
I think it's this balance. So we're doing a new production of this play now, and to sort of ensure that we get the balance right. So we obviously we want to make sure that in telling this piece, and this piece is a number of testimonies interspersed with ensemble pieces. So there is, in the form of it, there's quite a complicated structure and form to how these stories are communicated. Some of the testimonies are told simply, and it's a person talking to you. Others are kind of story told, and we move through different registers. So it's about trying to ensure that even though we sort of find a theatrical form, that we don't sort of overwhelm the concrete, personal, human testimony. And also, you know, we have 6 actors that are transforming throughout the piece and telling the various stories, and most of the stories they're telling are of 80-year-old people. And I suppose we had to make a choice quite early on about, well, how realistic do we go with it, or how much do we trust in what theatre does, which is kind of going, you know, allows us to transform and allows us to imagine the different multi-rolling experiences that we can convey. So I suppose making sure that we make that persuasive, that we allow for 6 people to carry the stories of the many that are represented in this experience. All of that, the balance of those things, is quite challenging.
Something I've been thinking a lot about is the power of eyewitness testimony, oral history, with very difficult histories, colonial histories that Britain is kind of now in a moment where we are looking at. How do you think oral testimonies can cut through when we're having these quite kind of ostensibly fractious conversations about our past?
So the wonderful opportunity with oral testimonies is that you're not hearing from politicians who have ideologies that they're sort of propounding. You're hearing people's personal experience, and often when those aren't filtered, what you hear are really quite sort of complicated, contradictory things that constantly surprise you, and you know, even though a lot of these people in these stories have been affected by sort of sectarianism and tribalism, they are all of them conflicted. They are all of them complex and nuanced and surprising, and nobody's interested in the destruction of the other. They're all interested in living, in thriving, in making it work.
Yeah, although it's interesting because they will tell you that there were moments when they may have been interested in the destruction of the other. And yet in the same sentence will say, but then my best friend who was the other, I love them, and what could I do? So it's really complicated.
But you see, I think that's what's wonderful about the oral testimony, is no matter how much we might be told by newspapers and politicians that people are a certain way and belong to certain tribes, people don't live their lives in that way. And the oral testimonies communicate that to you. They communicate that people are not a set of ideologies. You know that, as you say, they are often they're more motivated by love and security for themselves. That they a lot of the times when they've done things that are in retrospect, uncomfortable for them, that they don't, at the time they weren't often very clear about why they were doing it.
But I also think that oral testimonies help an audience, because I think that when you're dealing with a historical event that feels a long time ago, or feels far away, you can understand that human emotion. You can understand being told you've got to leave now. What would you take? So you think, what would I take? Or you think about yourself in that circumstance. The fear, the sadness, the loss. Never seeing your childhood home again, never seeing your best friend again. And I think that once you feel that connection to the audience member, who, by the way, could be your neighbour at home or could be your doctor, you can then begin to talk about that difficult history. And I think that is the power of oral testimony.
And you can't deny their personal experience. That is authentic. And when you represent a range of it, you kind of go, well, it isn't one thing. That the center of gravity of that experience is so complicated. It just opens it all out. And, nothing is binary. Nothing is reductive in that way.
So what I would say to kind of younger people, much younger than us, is don't feel there are things that are off limits. Nothing's off limits. And I think it's a really exciting time to be creative. And I also think there is still so many stories that haven't been told, and these stories are all around us, and be vigilant to those. But the way you tell them is going to be really original to you. And so just be fearless. Because I think that people are ready to hear different things and different experiences, and we're relying on you, the next generation, to do that.
That's brilliant.
Because we for us, and I feel it's quite late in my life to be talking about certain subjects. I mean, it's 70 years after partition. I've just done something on the Bengal famine, which is 80 years. But, you know, the next generation probably don't feel like there are things that they have to talk about.
How free did you feel when you were beginning to sort of, what were the opportunities that were available to you at the beginning? How free,
to do those subjects?
Yeah, how qualified did you feel in terms of like what the industry was making available to you?
I came into all that much later,
right.
and I was just kind of, I wasn't a writer, I was a journalist, I was a television journalist,
yes.
I was working on a program called Newsnight.
Yes, yes.
I was doing like really hard, tough current affairs. And I suppose it was once I'd kind of established myself that I started looking into my life and my history, and I thought, hang on, I'm doing all these stories. Where are my stories? You know, I thought about my parents' generation who came in the post-war years, and there was nothing that I could find about, you know, that story, the equivalent Windrush story for South Asians. And so I started doing that. And then while I was doing that, this thing of partition kept coming out, and I was like, what is this? And then I thought, oh my God, there's this massive trauma in this country that nobody knows about. And that's when I started looking into partition and realizing it's everywhere, it's all around us in this country. And that pretty much every British South Asian has a connection directly or indirectly to partition. That's massive. Yeah. That's massive. And we just don't know. And we're not really, you know, we're not taught about it in schools. So I think that, you know, I've been part of that kind of moment of kind of unearthing it. But then there'll be all these other stories of legacy and what that's bequeathed to other generations, and then just other stories out there.
It's interesting because when I started, I mean I've had quite a complex way into theatre, but I started as a mathematician back in the day, and I've always loved music and theatre. But when I got to a certain age, the pressures, home pressures, were kind of, you know, do something that's useful, that's going to earn you money. And there weren't many examples of people, barely any examples of people who were working in these industries for me to sort of follow. But it was only when I at university, when I had a kind of a serious illness and then depression after that, that I properly stopped and kind of went, what is it that I really want to do? And I've always loved literature, music, theatre, and so and when I went back to university, I started doing theatre, and it was like a Damascus conversion. I needed to do it, and it was weird because I did not ask who's going to allow me to do this. I was full of this fire that I needed to build these communities in these rooms. The rehearsal room was a place where you could have the most extraordinary conversations, where people talked in a way and were vulnerable in a way about their stories. And so I didn't begin this by wanting to tell my story. It was about finding rooms where I could help others tell a story. And I think I was quite nervous of my story to begin with, because the industry wasn't welcoming that when I was beginning. And that's, I think, changed enormously. And I think, as you say, the opportunities now for us, for people of colour, the global majority, to recover, discover, store stories of otherness or history, of legacy of the past are rife.
Or just other stories.
But that's it.
Or anything. It doesn't have to be about otherness.
I think that's where we are now.
Yeah,
the really exciting thing now is that, you know, an Asian writer doesn't need to tell an Asian story. No. Quite the opposite. You know, tell your story, or tell somebody else's story.
Or just tell a story.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
The story of partition is a historical story, but it's not historical because it lives amongst so many people who live in our country and their children and their grandchildren. It's us as well. And it doesn't make sense to me that this story of partition is just in London or in one place. It's a story that has to be told. Yeah. And I don't want it just to be told in spaces where there's a large South Asian population.
No,
it has to be in places where, you know, there are many Brits who are going to come and watch it too, because it's our story.
Yeah, that's right.
It was British India. It was the moment that the Brits left. It was a British line. It's British history, and so I think it's really important that everybody hears and comes to watch this all around the country. But I also think it's important that South Asians know their history. They don't always know.
No.
And they don't always know that partition is a story in their family, so it opens up other stories. But I also think it's important that British people know what their neighbours have gone through. And, you know, that when you ask that question, where are you from? For South Asians, it's a really complicated question, because, you know, we could say, you know, India or Pakistan, but actually that story began across a border. And that we can feel two things. You know, that we can feel that we're from Lahore and Delhi in a totally uncomplicated way. That's quite a long answer to the question, where are you from? But I think that, you know, we should know our neighbours. We should know each other.
I agree. And also, even as British Asians of whatever generation, there is, often when I'm asked, you know, so Pakistani legacy, and how Pakistani do you feel, how authentic do you feel? I mean, it's really problematic. You know, my engagement with that history, my engagement with the rituals of Pakistan, and what are they, and how much do they exist in me? And actually engaging with this story and the legacy of partition, you realize how complicated the journeys to here were, how much a lot of communities that then were based here and were successful here was built on a silencing of their past. And actually the ability to recover that is without shame, is an extraordinary gift. And as you say, for others, other Britons here who are white and maybe have often heard about that history in the context of being punished for the legacies of empire, this piece doesn't present it in that way. It's way more complicated than that. It wasn't something just that white Britain did to brown India. There was a complex of things happening in India as well. Enormous pressures before partition happened, and it's really important to sort of try and wrap your head around all of this and to recenter the narrative around all of these things. We're incredibly excited to be bringing Silence on tour. It'll start at Queen's Theatre Hornchurch, it's then going to Leicester Curve, Birmingham Rep, and then finishing at Manchester Home.